Everyone has some sort of a closet that's become too small. A closet is no place to live, and I want to support as many people as I can in stepping out of that prison into the fullness of life that's waiting for them on the other side of that closet door. I'm Nancy Shadlock from Centered Life Coaching. Join me in listening to these Coming Out Chronicles. Get curious about your story, and then see what good things are waiting for you on the other side of your closet door. I got a little bit of fangirl going on today. I can't believe it. I got an author that I really respect and who really helped me on my coming out journey. And so it feels so special to have him on the show here today. As usual, we talk a little bit about conversion therapy, and there could be some triggers around lots of spiritual talk if you're have come out of that and aren't into spiritual or Christian talk, I should say. But it's a really beautiful conversation and leads into some tools in how to have hard conversations with important people in your life. So I hope you enjoy it. Justin Lee, I am so excited to have you on the show today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I I'm a little bit in awe that you're here, to be truthful, because I read your book when I very early times when I was in my coming out journey, and it was so helpful for me. It was helpful for my parents. And so to be able to have you here today is just like really huge and really special to have you. So thank you.
Oh, that's so sweet. Well, now you're going to get me all choked up and then I won't be able to say anything on the podcast. So, but thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
Yeah. So the way I like to start these interviews is tell us the coming out story that you'd like to share. And that could be your LGBT one, or it could be some other coming out story. But I want to hear what what it is that you had to come out about and what led to that for you.
Yeah. Well, I think for me the most significant coming out story is also the obvious one for anybody who knows me, because it's one that I talk about a lot. I grew up in a very conservative evangelical home where there was really no question, um, in my family or in my church or in my community that uh, being gay was a sin, that it was something people chose, that it was a sinful thing that you shouldn't choose, that it was something that if you were gay and didn't want to be, you could become straight. That's what I grew up with. And being a good good evangelical Christian boy, I certainly didn't think that gay people had anything to do with me. I mean, I was the kid who was, handing out tracts at school and stuff and annoying my friends with um, all of the things that all of the negative things that evangelicals are unfortunately known for. And I'm sort of,
I'm laughing with you because I was just trying to see if it was around here somewhere. Yesterday was my son's birthday, and
uh
we got a bunch of balloons, and I got these really long, like my wife actually got all these really long balloons, and she's like, I was hoping we could like make something. And I was like, oh yeah, I know how to do that. She's like, how do you know how to make balloon animals? And I'm like, well, we used to go street witnessing, and the balloon animals were a great way to get people to come and
oh
talk to
no.
you so that you could tell them about Jesus. It's like, oh.
It is it's always interesting looking back on those times because my faith is still very important to me. There are elements of it that have changed, but my faith, my Christian faith is still very important to me. And yet I'm much more aware now than I was growing up of how the kind of stuff that I grew up with is perceived by folks outside of that world. I didn't understand growing up why everybody wouldn't be jumping at the chance to listen to the kind of stuff that I wanted to tell them, about my faith. And now I get it, because when you've been on the receiving end of that kind of, I hate to say self-righteous preaching, but self-righteous preaching, you see it very differently.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that I look back at that time and it's sort of like, on the one hand, I'm glad for pieces of that, but on the other hand, some of it's very cringeworthy, and I'm definitely cringing when I think of it. But but yeah, so I grew up with all of that and with those kinds of attitudes toward gay folks. And long story short, I eventually had to come to terms with the fact as a teenager that I was gay. And that was something that I really wasn't prepared for because, as I said, I'd been taught that it was a choice and I didn't choose it. I had always considered myself straight. I was dating a girl, and being gay, for one thing, my images of gay men were scary and uncomfortable images that had nothing to do with me. And for another thing, you know, I had never been given any kind of framework for how does somebody like me deal with growing up gay? Like, what does the future look like? How do you do this? And so yeah, so the big story for me, I guess, is just the process of coming to terms with that and then having to tell the people in my life that this good Christian boy who, whose parents were very proud of him, and all the other, parents in my church wanted their kids to hang out with me because I was the good epitome of what a good Christian boy was supposed to be. To tell all those people that I was gay, which for them was the antithesis of everything a good Christian boy was supposed to be, and then figure out where I was going to go with my life after that.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that was not it. It was not an easy experience.
So you kinda came to terms with it within yourself at what age?
I first used the word gay for myself, I think when I was 18. Um, it was a bit of a process where for a while I tried to convince myself that I was bisexual, as a way of getting around the fact that I was dating a girl and I didn't want to face the possibility of a future where I couldn't have a wife and kids and lead a ministry, the kinds of things that I was taught I should aspire to do, and that I did aspire to do. Um, so, I for a little while I thought I could reconcile everything by calling myself bi, but the reality is I was never bi. I was gay. So I was 18 when I finally came to terms with that. And even then, that came after years of trying desperately not to be attracted to guys and praying to God about it and crying myself to sleep night after night, begging God not to let me feel this way anymore. And even at that point, when I finally realized I was gay, it was not, I didn't have the experience of coming out to myself in a sense of like, this is who I am, and this is who I'm gonna be. It was more like I've described it before as like a diagnosis for a disease. It was like, oh, I somehow I got the gay, and I wouldn't have said that, of course, but I thought it was something that needed to be fixed, that could be healed, and so then I went through a period of, okay, I'm gay, but this is a temporary situation, and then it was um it was a while before I really came to terms with, this is how things are going to be, and I'm just going to have to readjust my vision of what my future is going to look like.
Mhm. What was that threshold like?
um so in evangelical circles, there was at the time, and still is unfortunately, this um movement. It's not as strong as it used to be, but there was this movement of what were then called ex-gay ministries. These Christian groups trying to make folks straight. And they did this, they tried to do this in different ways, some of them using more psychological methods, some of them using more religious methods, some of them using some kind of combination. But I spent a bunch of time learning about the groups that were out there and talking to all of these supposed ex-gay success stories who would all give these testimonies in churches and say, oh, I used to be gay and now I'm straight. And I would say, oh, how'd you do it? And it would inevitably turn out every time I actually got to sit down with somebody and ask them questions that they didn't actually go from gay to straight. They were changing their terminology. And so, what they really meant by I used to be gay is I used to live in a particular way. I used to publicly identify myself as gay and hook up with lots of different people and all these things. And what they meant by now I'm straight is, and now I'm married to somebody of the opposite sex. Not attracted to them, still attracted to the same sex. All that's changed is my behavior and the word I'm using for myself. But, I've gone from gay to straight thing. And I realized that the orientation change that was being promised by these groups wasn't real. And that was kind of, when I realized that, then it sort of blew my mind, because it was like, well, I had been taught my whole life by my church and by all the people I trusted that these groups were real and that being gay was a choice, or at least something that could be changed. And when I realized that that wasn't the case, it was like, well, now do I have to doubt everything or disbelieve everything that I've been taught by everyone I've ever trusted? Um, and now how do I go back and tell all of those people that I don't believe the stuff uh, that they taught me, without them thinking that I'm just a heretic? And that was a very painful process, because I mean, my parents especially, I loved and respected my parents more than anybody in the world. My parents were just incredibly awesome people. Um, but they had believed the same stuff that I had believed. They'd been taught the same things about LGBTQ folks and gay folks in particular, in the church that I'd been taught. And so when it's just the idea of coming out to them, like, I think coming out, we talk about coming out is not uh, a one and done kind of thing. Coming out, I think, is a process. um and you can have when you're LGBTQ, you can have been out to the people who know you for many years and then still have to come out to a medical provider, or have to come out to somebody who's helping you, in a store or some, for some reason. um there's It's a continual process. But for me, I think the hardest coming out was coming out to my parents, because I knew that they had all these negative views of gay folks, and I didn't want them to think negatively of me, or think that I was just going off down some uh, path toward destruction, which I was afraid they would think. Um, yeah.
So tell us that story then. How did that go down?
So I came out to a few people before that. I had come out to my girlfriend, which was not an easy thing, but interestingly, she was very supportive. She was actually way more pro-gay than I was at the time when I came out to her. I came out to her before I came to the conclusion that I wasn't going to become straight. And so I came out to her sort of as like, I want to tell you what I'm going through, but eventually I'm going to be straight and we can be together, And
Did she stay with you through that?
she did. Well, she did, but also she didn't put any pressure on me to stay together as a couple. She was like, maybe you should just accept yourself, and she got me this book on gay Christians. And I was like, how dare you? She was much smarter than I was in that moment. I'd come out to a few close friends, And I had come out to one of the pastors at my church. My family went to this mega church, so it was, it was one of these churches with a whole bunch of different pastors who oversee different parts of the church work. And I had come out to someone I trusted at the church who had referred me to this pastor who was leading what now I know was an ex-gay ministry. And so what's interesting was, even though he wasn't affirming, he wasn't in any sense pro-gay, and he believed that it was something that could and should be changed, he understood something that a lot of the Christians in my life at that time didn't understand, which was that um, being gay wasn't something that I chose. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't something to preach at me about, and that it was a very painful thing. Coming out to myself in that context was painful. It was very isolating. So he understood those things and was really very kind and very, very supportive of me as a person, even though looking back, I wouldn't say that he was supportive in the way that I would hope that other LGBTQ folks coming out would have someone to support them in their lives,
Mhm.
if that makes sense. Um, but he did understand, at least to some extent, what I was going through. And so I asked him if he would help me tell my parents. At the time, I had finished high school. It was the summer before I went to college. And I knew that I was going to be moving out to go to college. And I didn't want um, to leave home without telling my parents. I wanted to be able to explore what this meant at the university, and I didn't want to. And I guess I should clarify for those listeners who are from places where college and university don't mean the same thing. I mean this as an American, where they mean the same thing. Um, I wanted to be able to deal with all of this while I was in college, and I didn't want my parents to hear about it from somebody else, and so I said to him, I want to tell them the week before I leave home, so that they have a week with me to ask their questions, and then I can get out of there in case they respond badly. And it's not that I thought that my parents were going to turn violent or hateful. I know some people that is a fear that they have, or something that they've had to face. That wasn't my concern. It was just I was worried that things might get so uncomfortable, that I didn't want to have to spend the whole summer with my parents thinking that I was a terrible person and seeing them every day,
Mhm.
And so he invited my parents to the church for a meeting and didn't tell them what it was about. And because they were very involved in the church, they didn't think anything of it. And the plan was that I was going to secretly be in his office already before they got there, so that when they arrived for this meeting, I would be there, and then we would have a conversation. And what we hadn't anticipated was that my parents, as they were preparing to leave for this meeting, asked if I would do some chores around the house, which I couldn't, because I was always very honest with my parents. I couldn't think of an excuse why I shouldn't have to do these chores, on the spot. And so stupidly just said, "Oh yeah, no, okay, I'll do them." And then had to figure out, "Well, okay, somehow I have to sneak out of the house to get to church before my parents get there." And I think it tells you everything that you have to know about the kind of kid that I was.
Yeah.
The only time in my life I ever snuck out of the house was to go to church before my parents. So, but that's what I did, and I wrote about this in my book Torn in a lot more detail, but it was just excruciating. I was sitting in the pastor's office for what felt like decades, waiting on my parents to arrive. And when they did, the pastor I kind of thought was going to give an introduction, of some kind, and say, well, here's what's going on or whatever. And instead, he just sort of said, well, Justin has something he'd like to share with you. Justin? And and then I'm just sitting there like, okay. And It took I couldn't tell you how long it took for me to tell them, um, that I was gay. It was, because I mean, in my mind, it felt like I was sitting there for an eternity just trying to find the words. Um, and so I have no idea if it was like, you know, seconds or minutes or hours. Like it just, felt like forever. Uh, but I told them, and my mom cried and my dad looked kind of shell shocked, and they were both very loving. Um, I was very, very fortunate in that neither one of them responded in an angry sort of way, but I think both of them were worried for me. This wasn't something they expected. They didn't know how to deal with it any better than I did. Um, and I'd had a lot of time to think about it before I told them, and they hadn't had any time to think about it.
Right.
And over that next, well, at that meeting, and then over the next week, and then the months and years that followed, we had a lot of conversations where it felt like, sometimes two steps forward and one step back, and sometimes it felt like one step forward and two steps back, where I would think we were making progress, and then one of them would say something that just made clear to me that they really didn't understand what I was going through, and they tried to be supportive, but also we ended up having a lot of arguments because when I decided that I wasn't going to try to become straight anymore, they thought that I had lost, not that I'd lost my faith, but that I was giving up on God to fix things, which in their mind, of course, God wanted to fix things, which for them meant me becoming straight. Um, the kind of fixing at that point that I wanted was my family to be uh, reconciled, for my parents to come around to support me as a gay man, but that wasn't where they were, and that wasn't where they thought things were supposed to go, and that created a lot of tension for a long time. They finally did come around and become supportive, but it took a lot of years.
What helped them come around?
I think some of it was just time, um, having the chance to sit with it and pray about it and think about it and read about it and um, talk to folks. I tried at the time to find good books for them, and I discovered that really there weren't at the time a lot of good resources that were pro-gay and also spoke their evangelical language. There were
Mhm.
resources that were, you know, uh, we didn't say LGBTQ at the time, but now I would say LGBTQ affirming, resources. But not many of them were Christian or even particularly Christian friendly, and the ones that were tended to use different sorts of Christian language and speak to different, Christians from different types of backgrounds, and just didn't resonate with them as evangelicals. And so years later, that became one of my big missions in life, to help create those kinds of resources. And that's a lot of what I do now, so that kids who are coming out in those kinds of families now have more options, more resources. And thankfully, not just from me, but from other folks who also have taken that on as part of their mission. But whenever I found anything that I thought could speak to them, I gave them that. Um, but I honestly, I think a lot of it was time. And I think one of the things that really helped push my dad over the edge, to become really fully supportive, um, was actually a really tragic thing. But my mom some years ago passed away of a brain disease, and at the time that she got sick, both of my parents had become way more supportive than they had started out. Both of them had gotten to the point where they understood that I was gay, that I didn't choose to be gay, that there wasn't any way to change it. They knew that a lot of my work was in LGBTQ friendly ministry, which was interesting that that ended up being such a big part of my life. And they were supportive of that. But we still weren't quite on the same page about marriage. And there was this question of like, someday I would like to get married. And, will you guys support me? When I get married, will you come to the wedding and everything? And they were really struggling with that a lot because they still had all these Bible questions. And we'd sat down and we'd talked about my perspective on the Bible questions and all of that. But there was still, particularly for my dad, a certain hesitation, a certain worry about, um, what does God think about all this? And after my mom died, my dad was left um, with really a very profound sense of loneliness. They had been married for a number of decades, and you know, he I mean, they got married, relatively young, and so he had spent really his whole adult life married to my mom, and loved her until her dying day, and so um, all of a sudden he was left trying to figure out how to do life on his own, and I'm happy to say that he did eventually meet another woman and got remarried. And I think my stepmom is a wonderful, incredible person. I'm thrilled that she's part of the family. I know mom would have approved, but before that happened, my dad had to spend some time really sitting in that loneliness. And he told me he came to hear me speak at a conference this one time after going through that. And it at this in this talk that I gave, I made a joke about being single, and as I often did, and I said, "Oh, if anybody knows any eligible guys out there, just I'm single, just so you know." And um, after the talk, my dad said, "I was thinking about what you said about being single," and he said, "I I have been so lonely since your mom passed, and it's really made me think about what that means to go through life like that, and I don't want you to have to go through life like that. And if you can find somebody, who makes you happy, I want you to have that."
Hmm.
And it's so interesting. My dad, a very devout Bible believing man, we had gone through all the Bible stuff over and over. We'd gone through all of the different rational and logical arguments over and over. But at the end of the day, what really made the difference for him was the emotional connection of realizing what it's like to to love somebody and lose them, and to not be able to have a companion when you really want one. And and I think that was what pushed him over the edge and made him say, I don't want this for my son, and I don't think God wants this for my son.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think that's a lot of the gift of your book is that it's helping people have a human connection, that it's not just scriptures or not just rhetoric, but it's like it's story and people can enter in and yes, you use some Bible verses, so it helps people that have that language, but then it also is your story and you can't really argue with someone's story. And I found that over and over again, like what in churches and places where people are fighting about this stuff. It's all fine and dandy when it's just theology or verses or someone's dogma, but when it's someone's actual life, then it changes in some ways, especially if you dare to get to know them.
Yeah. Yeah, and because I come from a tradition that values the the text, the biblical text very highly, I have a lot of what's the word I want? Uh, a lot of empathy for folks in those spaces who get frustrated, as I got frustrated growing up when I was looking for answers that were like Bible answers, and I would encounter folks who were from different traditions or who were not religious, who would say, look, why does it matter what this
Mhm.
book from thousands of years ago says. And it's like, well, it matters to me. It matters to me, and it matters to my family, and it matters to the people close to me. Um, so it's still a huge part of my life. It's still an important part of my life. And so I don't at all want to neglect that. And it's very important to me to deal with the biblical texts and what that means and all that stuff. But I agree with what you just said, that I think that ultimately that just to uh, write about Bible passages and arguments, it doesn't, in my experience, change anybody's mind. If somebody is ready to change their mind and all they need is help me understand a different way to read this Bible text, then that's one thing. But for somebody who's not there yet, it's really the stories. It's that emotional connection that moves them. I mean, my dad is just one example of that. I've seen it over and over in my work.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is what I try to do, to combine the personal stories and dispelling misconceptions about LGBTQ folks with the other pieces like the Bible analysis and stuff when people need it. But it's not just that Bible analysis. It's the stories that ultimately change minds. I think that's why doing a podcast where people tell their stories. I mean, this is true in so many areas of life, that stories are incredibly powerful. You change the world with stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe that. So then how does your second book relate to this? And tell us about that book and then what the work is that you're doing now.
Sure. So my first book, Torn, was as you said, sort of a combination of my coming out story and wrestling with all that stuff as being this really good Christian evangelical kid, and coming out as gay and figuring out what that meant, and wrestling with the Bible and all that. And I wrote it for um, parents like my parents and other LGBTQ folks who were coming out in those kinds of Christian environments, and the Christians in their lives, to say, look, this is what this is like. That let me tell this story to you to help you understand, so that you can empathize with this person, your loved one who's coming out, or the people in your congregation who are coming out. And after Torn came out, I started hearing from a bunch of people who said, I read Torn and I love the conclusions you drew, and I'm on the same page with you, and I'm LGBTQ myself, or my kids are, or I'm an ally. um I support your affirming position on this, but I don't know how to talk to my parents about this. I don't know how to talk to my pastor about this. I don't know how to talk to my bigoted uncle about this. um there are people in my life who I want to talk to about the stuff that's in your book, but I don't think that I can get them to sit down and read a book. And so, how do I have this conversation? How do you talk to somebody you think is really wrong and actually get them to listen instead of just ending up in a fight?
Hmm.
And since at that time, by now, this is work I've been doing for 20 plus years. I'm thinking, well, I have answers to that. There are techniques I found work and techniques that I found don't work. And I can tell you what I think works and how I get people to reconsider their positions and stuff. But I thought, boy, that's a that's a niche audience. I don't know that I can get anybody to publish that book. If I write just this is a book for LGBTQ Christians and their family members who want to have a conversation with somebody who's not affirming and really want to read a whole book about how to do it, and who've read my first book and know who I am, that, I was like 10 people or something. And so I'm like, I don't think I can get a publisher to publish that. And so I'd been sitting with this idea for several years. How do I write this book and get it out there? And the light bulb went on for me after Donald Trump's election. And in the days after the election, by this time I had built enough of a reputation for being somebody who people on different sides of ideological and political divides would listen to. That, like, I would be speaking to a very politically liberal LGBTQ organization one day, and then a few days later I'd be speaking to a very conservative evangelical organization the next day. And so um So it just happened after, in the days after Trump's election, I was scheduled to speak uh, to different groups, and I was in different rooms of people who had really, really different perspectives on what had just happened, on um, whether they agreed or disagreed with the outcome of the election, on what they thought that people on the other side of the political aisle were thinking and why they voted that way. And I was listening to these two different groups and thinking, boy, these folks have no idea about each other. They don't understand each other at all.
Mhm.
And it struck me that the same kinds of principles that I use to talk about this one particular topic with a lot of people also work when you're talking about politics, you're talking about vaccines, you're talking about science, climate change, you're talking about whatever the issues are that you care about, racism, sexism. And I thought, boy, that's a book. And so I wrote a book called Talking Across the Divide. And the name is a bit of an homage to an organization I used to be part of that doesn't exist anymore, but it was an internet-based organization called Bridges Across the Divide. And so Talking Across the Divide is about the techniques that we can use to have conversations with people we disagree with, when it's not just a matter of opinion. It's not just, do you prefer chocolate or vanilla, but it's like, this is an issue that the right answer matters. Everybody's not right. Somebody's got to be wrong. I think you're wrong. You think I'm wrong. How do we talk about it and really make progress and maybe change each other's mind, or at least one of us change their mind, but stay friends? It seems like a tall order right now because things are so polarized.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's what I wrote about. So these days I'm doing a lot of speaking. Well, not during the pandemic, except I'm doing some virtual speaking during the pandemic, um, but I have been doing a lot of speaking and webinars and things um, on both the LGBTQ and faith stuff, and also this other stuff that's not necessarily related to either of those topics, but but how do we talk about the issues that we disagree on? So like I just did a talk for a group of healthcare providers on the anti-vax movement. And you know these are folks who want to see more people vaccinated, and yet they deal with a lot of people who have concerns about vaccines. And how do you have that conversation in a way that's productive instead of just getting frustrated with each other?
Mhm.
um, so that's been really fun. It's a little bit intimidating sometimes because some of these are big topics, and because I think social media is increasing our polarization in a lot of ways.
Totally. That's the
But
biggest
yeah,
thing that I took from that Social Network show that was on Netflix,
yeah,
of, like, my feed is all like this, and my dad's feed is all like this, and no wonder we can't understand each other because we see total different feeds, and so we have total different worldviews on some things.
yeah. I loved that documentary. I thought it was great. It came out after I'd already written Talking Across the Divide, so I wasn't able to reference it in Talking Across the Divide. But thankfully, a lot of the stuff that was in there I'd already talked about in my book, so it sort of was vindication for
Mhm.
me. I was like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
no, I know
Somebody
about
else is
this.
seeing this too, yeah.
But I think it was dead on, and I recommend it to folks who haven't seen it. Was it the Social Dilemma? I think it was called.
Right.
And yeah, I do think we have to be aware of that. That often somebody who seems like they're being unreasonable, it's not necessarily just that they're being unreasonable, but that they have heard over and over and over again a different set of facts. And so often we go into an argument, and this is only one of the many pieces, but often we go into an argument assuming that at least we both agree about what it is that we're arguing about, what it is that we're disagreeing about, what the situation is, what the options are, and what would be the outcomes of those options. And often a lot of that isn't true. It's sort of like that trope that you see in a lot of movies and TV shows where you have two characters who have a conversation and they think they're talking about two completely different things. and it's played for comedy usually on TV and in the movies, and the conversation goes on and gets sillier and sillier because one person thinks they're, talking about one thing, and somebody else thinks, oh, they're talking about something completely different. But in real life, we do that a lot without realizing it. And it's not funny, it's
Mm-hmm.
tragic
Mm-hmm.
because the communication breaks down before we even realize that we're not starting from the same set of facts. And even when we realize it, we don't know how to convince the other
Yeah.
person.
How do you get to that place of starting from the same set of facts? Or is that
Well,
important?
I mean, I wish there were an easy answer to that, that would solve a lot of our global problems right now.
Mhm.
I think the answer is complicated. I think the shortest answer I can give is that it goes again back to stories, where stories are often way more compelling than statistics and dry facts. Um, I can tell you, uh, all I want, that this model of car, for instance, is safer than this other model of car because of all the tests that have been done and whatnot. But if you had a bad experience with the one that I'm trying to, talk up, or you had a really good experience with the one that I'm not so fond of, that anecdote, that personal experience, or the story of, your cousin who told you about this thing that happened to her or whatever, is often way more powerful than all the statistics and all this stuff. And so a lot of it is about building emotional connection. It's about making people feel heard. It's about, even when somebody's wrong, stopping and listening and giving them the chance to tell you what they think, and actually paying attention to what they believe to be the case and why, where they got their information, what sources they trust, and all that stuff before you talk. Because people are way more willing to listen after they feel like they've been heard, and feel like you've genuinely listened to them and not just, waited for your turn to talk. There are lots of things like that that we can do, um, that none of which are a miracle cure for misinformation, but bit by bit, we can chip away at the misinformation, and there are ways to work together even before somebody admits that the information was wrong, even across, lines of disagreement.
Hmm. Yeah, that's for any relationship, I think that's key.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, absolutely, because at the end of the day, none of us is going to go through life only, or at least we shouldn't, only interacting with people who agree with us on everything. You
Mhm.
know, even a spouse, even a best friend is not going to agree with you on everything all of the time. And so
Yeah.
we all have to learn how to, find not just compromise, because there's some issues you can't compromise on, but how to find ways of working together, ways of finding a common vision of the world, even when there's disagreement, ways of acknowledging, okay, here's the thing that we see differently. Let's talk about why we see it differently. Let's understand the stories and the emotions that are wrapped up in that, and the ego, and the, all of that stuff. And then figure out, okay, maybe we still don't agree on what to do. Is there any piece of what to do that we can still agree on? Is there any piece of it, and how important is it, and all of these questions that we can ask to find common ways forward, even when we're not on the same page. And I think that's really vital.
Mhm. And, like, honoring the humanity in each other.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, I use that phrase a lot. At the end of the day, um, you and I, are we're not just the sum total of our beliefs. We're human beings with a lot of experience, and whose emotions get in the way of being perfectly logical, even when we think we're being logical. And so, it's, if I only see you as my opponent because you believe something that I think is horrible or very wrong, um, I'm going to have a lot less chance of changing your mind if that's something that I want to do, um, than if I can see you as a complete person and relate to you as that, and still let's be friends even while we disagree. And maybe, if we're friends without any ulterior motive, if we have a genuine friendship, then actually it ends up giving you a greater likelihood of listening to what I have to say down the road, and vice
Right.
versa.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. So, what's your next coming out chapter going to be?
Well, I think one of the challenges for me right now is finding figuring out who I want to be, I guess, and what the future looks like. I think all of us, we sort of spend our time in at least one of two modes, either trying to grapple with whatever's going on right now, like let me figure out how to deal with the stress and anxiety and obstacles of today, if I could just get through today, and figuring out the future, like where am I going. Often we're doing both at once. I think right now I'm a lot in sort of where am I going mode. um, I, as I said, I spent 20 plus years doing LGBTQ faith work, and I still do it. It's still an important part of, of who I am. But when you do something for that long and get well known for doing it, um, people start to put you in a box, so that is the sum total of who you are. And
Hmm.
for a lot of people, I'm that gay Christian guy, which is funny because there are lots of LGBTQ Christians in the world. It's not like I'm the only one, but there,
Mhm.
for a lot of folks, I'm like that gay Christian guy, and I'm sort of like, well, okay, I am that, but I'm a lot of other things too, and I would sort of like to, like my book Talking Across the Divide is not about being uh, gay and Christian at all. It's written for a an audience, that may be, um, it's for a secular audience. So, uh, and it's not written specifically to an LGBTQ audience. I acknowledge, that part of myself, but so figuring out how to balance all of that, how to like talk about some of these other things that I want to talk about the political division of society and these difficult conversations and stuff without, how do I say this? I'm a little worried. um, I'm a little worried as I have more of those conversations that at some point, uh, I'm going to get a reputation for having a particular position on a particular issue. And then that's just going to color everything because we're such this polarized society that
Mm.
somebody's going to be like, oh, well, because you said this, that means you're on the other side of the political aisle for me. And therefore, I'm not going to listen to you on anything else, which would kind of defeat the purpose of like my whole life's work. So figuring out how to balance that and how much of my personal views on these issues I do want to come out about, I guess.
Mhm.
Is it
Mhm.
important for me to say what my view is on, guns or abortion or healthcare or, uh, whatever, in order to talk about how we talk about those issues? And if I use this language or that language, will people assume if I don't say what my position is, will they assume correctly or incorrectly? And how does that reflect on everything else? That's something that I still wrestle with, and I don't know the answer to it, but it's something I'm kind of taking day by day, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah, especially if you like one of your skills is being able to be in a conservative organization one day and a liberal organization the next day. That chameleon approach kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, as a general rule, I've tried not to do it in a way that requires me to, um I think there's a danger when you do too much of that, of of becoming two-faced, where
Mhm.
I've seen people take that approach to other issues where they end up with people on both sides assuming that they're on the same side as them, and that can become kind of dishonest, right? Where it's like, um if the people on one side think, oh, you're one of us and you're telling us how to talk to those folks, and the people on the other side think, oh, you're one of us, you're telling us how to talk to those folks, eventually the truth's going to come out. And if the only way that you're able to build a bridge is by not ever saying what your position is. I don't think that's healthy, because in daily life, most of us have positions we care about on things, and we want to be able to talk about our position. So like when I talk to folks about, being gay and Christian, I'm very open about the fact that I'm gay, I'm Christian, I'm big supporter of same-sex marriage and plan to get married one day, and here's where I'm theologically on these things. But I try not to bring in too much extraneous stuff. I'm not going to, like, I'm going to, let's go point by point through every theological position that Christians disagree on, and I'll tell you which one I think is the right one. Like, that would just alienate my audience. But I do try to at least be honest about where I'm coming from. So that's the balancing act, is like being honest, not trying to pretend that I don't have positions, but also not needlessly throwing my view on everything into everything. Because in this polarized world, it's sort of like, if you get known for having an unpopular position on something, you can get written off before you get the chance to actually say, anything meaningful. So
Hmm. Yeah,
yeah.
I really hear you on that. I fought for a long time calling myself a coming out coach, both because, like you said earlier, it's not just a one-time thing, but a lot of people do think of it just as this one-time thing, and so like, "Oh, I've already come out. I don't need a coming out coach." I'm like,
Mm.
"But there's all these points along your life where you're gonna keep coming out to people or coming out about a different thing." Um, but then also that it makes it so narrow, and, like, mostly I work with queer folks, but I also love working with all kinds of people. Like, I'm trained as a spiritual director, and so I can sit with people of all kinds and help them pay attention to, like, what's new, what's coming out in your life that is more true for you. But having that title sometimes feels like it narrows it, or it keeps me only in one camp, and so I
Yeah.
really hear you on that.
Yeah. But I think you're right, though, that coming out is, it's a part of life for all of us in a lot of different ways. And it is something that's ongoing. It is something that you never stop having to do. You never stop having to have potentially challenging conversations with folks where you tell them something that they may or may not want to hear.
Mhm.
um, and that's a part of living authentically, and part of it is deciding when and who do you want to tell, who is it not worth it to tell, and how much do you want to tell them, and all of that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing in the world. It is so impactful, I know, for myself and many around me and many all around the world. So please keep up this great work.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's so kind, and thanks for having me on the podcast, and the great conversation. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the Coming Out Chronicles. If you enjoyed it, give it a like. And if you think it would be helpful for someone else, please share it with them. If you'd like to connect with me, reach out on social. I'd love to support you on the next chapter of your coming out story. Until next time, this is Nancy Shadlock from Centered Life Coaching.